Well, for more on this, let's bring in Peter Alexander in Kuala Lumpur. He's a global food security lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. Really good to have you with us, Peter. This global food security crisis really was one of the unintended consequences of the war in Ukraine. Just underscore to us how important Russia and Ukraine are in terms of supplying food and food products to the world, especially to those in developing nations, including on the continent of Africa.
Yeah, we've just heard in your piece how important they are. 30% of wheat exports come from Russia and Ukraine combined. But that's slightly different to 30% of supply because obviously countries outside of Russia and Ukraine also produce wheat, and some of that wheat is not exported. So roughly 3/4 of the wheat that's produced is not traded internationally. So actually, in terms of supply, global supply, it's actually about 8% of the rest of the world's supply of wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. And that's still very significant, but there are other factors that are affecting the price of food and causing the increases in price of food and therefore the increases in malnourishment and eventually death through malnourishment. And that's changes in input costs to agricultural production. So fertilizer costs, fuel costs, transport costs, all these other inflationary pressures are also impacting food prices and consequently the affordability of food for the global, the poorest globally. And I think it's important to think about this, not just in terms of the disruption of exports. So I agree with almost everything that the UN Secretary General was saying. However, he also made the statement that we need to unblock the ports of Ukraine in order to sort of avoid these negative consequences. And obviously that would be beneficial. But if my kind of argument is correct, and it's not just the loss of those exports that's causing the negative outcomes, then sort of restarting those exports alone would be insufficient to avoid that crisis.
Yes, and to make matters worse, we've got another major wheat exporter, India, announcing a complete ban on exports to secure its own supplies amid a drought in some parts of their country. The obvious solution seems to be to end the conflict in Ukraine in order to get the food and wheat exported once again from both Russia and Ukraine. But what can countries do in the meantime to help those vulnerable countries with their food security?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, India's decision to impose a ban, it kind of just exacerbates the consequences that we're already seeing. Sort of limits that supply further and sort of makes markets more jittery and increases those prices, which kind of it's sort of self-fulfilling in a sense. So we kind of need to move to try and stop countries making those decisions, to those protectionist decisions. In terms of what else we do, we need to think about reducing those inflationary pressures on food, but also maybe we need to think about more targeted support for people who are on the lowest income to make those foods that they need affordable. It's arguable whether we've been paying the true cost of food production in terms of environmental externalities, climate change, loss of biodiversity in general. So, more expensive food isn't necessarily a bad thing. We need to look at the negative consequences in terms of nutritional health for the poorest of society and make sure we avoid those.
Okay, Peter Alexander, we really appreciate your analysis there. Thank you for joining us on TRT World.